Hey, good morning, all. It's August 16th. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Monday today. We're going to talk a little bit about important things happening in the news. And boy, if there was ever a time, Dan Dietrich, when we need to talk about the call for the common good, sort of spreads across our three topics, news topics today: Afghanistan, Haiti, and the continuing COVID situation in the U.S.
Yeah.
They all call for it. So Doug Padgett here in Minneapolis, and Dan Dietrich in South Bend, Indiana. Very famous place for the home of the transportation secretary.
That's right.
Do you ever see Pete around, or has he moved? What happens to those guys, Dan? Do they move to?
I think he moved to DC.
Secretary?
Yeah. So he'd sold his house. Someone else bought his house, and
Oh, really?
yeah,
He didn't just probably couldn't afford some other place. I don't know how people, in those jobs afford to move to DC.
Yeah.
It's a little shocking. I mean, depending on how much money a person earns in their life, they might think that politicians are paid a lot or a little, but I don't think they're paid very much in light of the responsibilities and the costs that go into maintaining jobs as somebody who's a departmental secretary for the federal government, or even a congressperson for that matter. I mean, it is something else. The strain put on those people financially to be able to pull all that stuff off.
Right. All the travel. You need apartments in different places. You need clothes. You need different outfits for different things.
And you got to pay for all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's a job that costs you a lot to have it. I remember when my first job that I ever had was at Burger King, over on old Highway 12 in Golden Valley, Minnesota. And I used to ride my bike, and I had to go buy a pair of pants, like some brown pants. They gave you a shirt, didn't give you the pants, and I was like, I don't know, 14, I think. Back before child labor laws, apparently.
Pants.
Yeah, I was like, as a kid, I was getting a job because I didn't have any money, and they're like, "Well, go buy some pants."
Got to have money to make money, Doug.
That's how it goes. All right, so we'll just dive right into it. Afghanistan has shown itself for the situation that it has been for a very long time.
Yeah.
And look, the pain that is being experienced by so many Afghanis is going to be incredible. First of all, it's been a country that's had a failing infrastructure for decades upon decades. So the level of poverty and the level of criminality that has been necessary to exist, especially with drug sales, because everything else has collapsed, has just made Afghanistan an extraordinarily difficult place for human beings to live for a very long time. And now with the U.S. presence out of Afghanistan, and then that cascading effect of all the other countries that also then left, is going to create a humanitarian struggle there. And I don't know what the United States was supposed to do. I'll say, I don't want to move too quickly from the pain of the people there and the call for the common good for every country everywhere. We talk about the common good in American politics, but boy, it sure seems like we also need the common good in every country's political sphere. And so, we totally ask for that for all the Afghanis and so on.
It's just, you worry especially about the women and the children under the Taliban rule, because that's just a nightmare for them. You've had 20 years of relative, there's been turmoil for sure, but for many young girls, they've grown up being able to go to school and learn to read and write and imagine a better future, and to have the rug yanked out from under you in this way has got to be just terrifying.
Just horrible. And the fear that the retaliation is going to be so much more severe, for people who followed that path. But here's the thing, is that civilizations, societies, they always need the people who are part of those societies to go along with it. If the people don't go along with it, then the government has to use power and control to force people to behave in ways that they're not choosing to behave. Mm-hmm. So in dictatorships, obviously, you have that where people are silent or only behave in certain ways because that's what's allowed. In other free systems, it's the governed who carry the power, not the people governing who carry the power. And in Afghanistan, the presence of the United States and other international forces was creating a reality that was not supported by the peoples.
Right.
This is what seems to be clear. Even the governments that were in place there, and it's clear that the Trump administration chose to lean into the Taliban and try to turn the Taliban into legitimate partners, which will go down as one of the great failures, international failures. Last March, Trump was saying, I spoke to the Taliban mullah. We're working out a deal. We've got all this stuff going. He wanted to invite them to the United States, to Camp David, on September 11th to talk about this great deal that the United States had struck. And Mike Pompeo was fully in on this. I saw pictures this morning of Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, in the room with the Taliban. So the Trump administration, this is totally on their hands. And it's totally in the hands of the Biden administration and how they chose to handle this transition of people out. That it almost couldn't have been worse. And I don't understand at all. Everyone was talking about it. Like, I don't pay a lot of attention to Afghanistan. And I was wondering, aren't they going to get out all of these people first? Like all the supporters, all the family members, all of this, do that now. And then the last thing you would do is remove forces, like after everybody's out. Why would you do it in the order they did? I don't understand that till this day. And it was a convoluted process. But even if we had fulfilled the responsibility to the peoples who worked with the U.S. government there, that's thousands of people. It's not the millions of people that are going to suffer. That other suffering wouldn't have been alleviated at all had the people more people who are close to the U.S. government been taken out safely. So that doesn't really, even if the Biden administration, which I think they have a lot of answering to do, and it's morally wrong that they didn't handle this better, that wouldn't have changed the situation of the people you were just speaking of, the young women, the young girls, the older women, the men who are going to be abused by an approach to governing that the Taliban has promised and has executed on. And it's going to be a very difficult country for the United States to look at. So the failures on the Biden administration, failures on the Trump administration, it's on the Obama administration, because the Obama administration continued a failing policy in Afghanistan, just pumping money and pumping military and training into the country. And there was no there was no chance that the civic structure of that country was going to support something that looked like the freedoms that were made possible when the U.S. government, when the U.S. military was there. So it was creating this false sense. It's like they put light bulbs in the room and told everybody the sun was shining. And it wasn't the sun that was shining. It was these light bulbs that were creating this impression. So we created the impression that there was all this advancement going on, and there wasn't. Instead, it was 20 years of the Taliban organizing itself over and over and over to be prepared to take over, which in some ways you'd think 20 years is a long time, but not if it's your country. Like the United States would if something were to happen in this country, we would all hold out for 2 decades. Until you get what you want. So the idea that after 20 years, the Taliban should have sort of seen their way. They weren't going to ever. They continued with a philosophy of governing that went unchallenged and unchanged. The Trump administration validated it, said they were decent working partners. Of course they weren't, but the Obama administration and then the Bush administration. Yeah. And here's where I think the common failure is in this. And oftentimes I prelude this, and I was thinking about this morning, that I should probably be careful about this, but I'm going to be a little less careful about saying this. The idea that our military is a solution to anything needs to seriously be challenged. Yeah. That our military leaders and their advice and their perspective is something that we should all be heralding as these are extremely wise people who know what's going on, needs to be questioned. We've done this thing in the United States where we've said that if you're in the military, you sort of get a pass on all kinds of things, and we give over a lot of our authority and our trust to military members, generals and advisors and all this in the military. And in Afghanistan, I was hearing this morning that the CIA has one opinion about what's going on in Afghanistan. The military the Pentagon and others through multiple administrations has had a different view, a much more rosy view, that they said, hey, we're building up these troops, we're training them, we have these
Mm-hmm.
commandos, like all thinking in these military terms. And it's just a bad approach.
Yeah.
Now, the State Departments are supposed to be a third alternative, right? So not intelligence from the Central Intelligence Agency, not the military from the military, not a military approach coming from the military personnel, but the State Department is supposed to have a view. They've also failed in Afghanistan. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't going to happen. And just again and again, especially in the last 50 years. Now, some people want to go back to World War II and talk about how great our military was to save us from, Nazi takeover. Okay. I'm not going to litigate any of that. But in the last 50 years, from Korea to Vietnam to every smaller battle that went on, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, all of these, the military has not been great in this country. Why we continue to act as if our military leaders and our military choices and our military actions, and like, I'm not picking on an individual soldier, but even at that level, what individual soldiers have done. We know all the cases, and we know how people were treated, and we know how these orders come down. This militarization of our approach to the rest of the world and the militarization to our approach in our own country is failure. I mean, look, military is only useful when all other options have failed. That never makes it a good option. It's
Mm-hmm.
just the only option available. And we should stop following military leaders in every situation as soon as possible and try to get other kinds of societal growth happening. And this is true everywhere in the world. So I don't know. This is just one of those places where I always feel unnerved and think it's inappropriate to do what I'm about to do, which is to take a real human crisis for the people of Afghanistan and use that to make a larger point that, I've wanted to make continuously all the time, but I'm sort of doing that right now. Right. So I think that our militarization and the approach of a military approach to the engagement of our country domestically or internationally is just fraught with failure. And we have to think in non-military terms across the board. We just
Mm-hmm.
give far too much political, social, cultural credence to the military.
And
And
unfortunately, we don't learn from our mistakes. On the screen, if you're just listening, we have a picture of Saigon, Vietnam, 1975, sort of an infamous photo of a helicopter rescuing people from the embassy there, and then a picture from yesterday in Afghanistan of, again, a helicopter rescuing State Department people from the embassy in Afghanistan. And
look at that. That's amazing.
it's a striking set of images, and it's a reminder, like, we've been through this. We tried this in Vietnam, we tried this in Korea, and it never works. You
Yeah.
can't.
It just doesn't work, and we keep behaving as if it does. And as Mike Dufresne says, the U.S. It's shameful. The U.S. didn't bring an example of grassroots democracy to Afghanistan. What they was given was corruption and allowing billionaires to make the rules. Yeah, there's a lot of this going on, and other people, Julia and Jeannie rather, and Barbara, sort of making their comments too. Yeah, maybe you can throw some of those up here. But this is the difficulty that we have when we're needing to take a military approach, because now, and it's not the old adage that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is the adage of, we really want to just keep making hammers. Like, it's not as if we don't have any other options. What else would we turn to? There are a lot of things you can turn to. There's a lot of ways for the United States of America not to be isolationist, to be engaged in the world, and not to have the military and militarization leading the way. But boy, in Afghanistan, across the board, you look at any of the people that you'll see in public spaces and arguing about this, the names that we recognize, they're all generals this and generals that, and it's a military presence. And the fact that we didn't believe that having a military presence, keeping the lid on what's going on in Afghanistan, was going to be a failure, because we tend to think, well, the military gets things right, and this is the great bluff in this country that
Mm-hmm.
um, we I think we're still in deep reaction from the middle 1970s when so many people in the United States turned against the war in Vietnam and spit on soldiers when they came back, turned against the military, a whole cultural shift. And we crossed a Rubicon there where people in this country said, hey, this like hatefulness to soldiers and military, we can't be blaming them for this. And then somewhere in the Reagan years and then through the 90s, we started to want again to sort of praise the military for its work. And then the Bush administration's 2 years really into the military. Obama really leaned into the military, funded it like crazy. Of course, Trump's ideas about the military was just, dictator like. And now even with Biden, it's like, hey, the military is the greatest thing. These are the people that we should herald. And I'm not saying that people that offer themselves to our public service through the military shouldn't be honored. Of course they should. But look, frankly, the fact that we treat school teachers and civic servants and people that work for your city municipality on your sanitation system don't ever get credit for what they do. But if you do that same work under the banner of the Defense Department, and you work in sanitation in Afghanistan, or you work in education, or you work in transportation in those places, then you're heralded in a whole different way in our society. And we have a weird relationship with our military. You can think all the way back to, Eisenhower saying, I'm fearful of the industrial militarized complex that's coming into place. It's all over our society. It's all over our country. And we do this thing where if you're active service member, even if your life's not put at jeopardy, we act as if, well, that's a different level of acceptance and honor in our society. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, look, I fly in airplanes, maybe more than some other people, but a lot of airlines, they say, hey, if you're an active service member, you go ahead and get on early. Well, that's a nice thing. I just wish airlines would also say, hey, and this month, if you're a school teacher, this month, if you're a nurse, month, yeah, if you work in public health, or this month, if you work in infrastructure somewhere, we just want you to know that we recognize the service that you do. So rather than, just saying like, well, let's, dog the military, let's talk about the other parts of our society that can be useful here. Because when our argument is the CIA was more right or the military was more right, I mean, holy cats, is that really what our options are left with? Mm-hmm. Because this creates distance from the American people. And look, people don't care about Afghanistan. We've done nothing to build in our society a connection of the people of the United States to the people of Afghanistan. I mean, other than a girl wanting to change school life there, we rally around that. A girl who was, attacked by the Taliban will cherish and herald one person, but even back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were exchanges that went on, but Afghanistan was never a safe enough place to even go to. After 20 years of military engagement in Afghanistan. And this then, when the Biden administration finally says it's time for this to come to an end, then they don't build in enough capacity to sort of solve for the responsibilities that people feel there. So I think that Afghanistan has always, at least for 20 years, represented something so much more rooted in our society and that we have to come to grips with. And the militarization of it all. So whether you take the militarization in Afghanistan or what we'll be talking about a bunch this fall when we travel along the border wall, how the border of the United States and Mexico has been militarized with people with weapons in their hands and razor wire and walls. I mean, it's just, we'll show you pictures as we travel this fall, that the United States looks like a war compound on our southern border because we think the military is the way to solve a border. It's just bananas. Or this summer when there's civil riots and protests, send in a bunch of militarization. And then when we really needed our military to do something and to protect our own capital, they're nowhere to be found. So it just is, I don't know.
Yeah, there's this mythology that the greatest military the world has ever seen, the most well-funded military the world has ever seen, can never lose, can never fail. Yeah. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with problems like an insurgency, people that lived there for generations and this is their country, and we've decided we don't want them there anymore. Like you said, they'll wait it out. They'll use tactics that don't require a lot of money, that don't require a lot of technology.
Yeah.
And somehow they defeated us. They defeated the world's greatest military. And
I mean, if you had said 20 years ago in 4 weeks, we're going to go into Afghanistan for 20 years. And at the end of it, the Taliban is still going to be around, is going to be in charge of that country. Sure, we wanted to root out terrorism,
Al-Qaeda,
for sure, and stop it from being a safe haven. But I'm trying to now remember the person who was the head of the Taliban in 2001, the taller guy, Omar, or I've forgotten his name. Isn't that something? But I always wondered, like, everybody went after, people were going to go after Osama bin Laden. But then there was this guy who was the head of the Taliban, and he just sort of got away. He's probably alive today. Like the United States never thought, oh, the organization, the military, the militia, the Taliban that was in charge of Afghanistan that allowed all of this to happen. That's what we need to deal with. You read it. Didn't really have an approach for that. Because the military will tell you, because that's not stuff the military can do. Like, for sure. I mean, the military is actually pretty good at telling the rest of society what it can do and what it can't do. It seeps over the line a little bit, gets a little more ambitious some days than it ought to, but it's pretty good at telling. But then the rest of society just says, we'll just let the military handle it. So the idea that the Taliban 20 years later has been around and then was, invited and then disinvited from coming to Camp David by Donald Trump for last September, on September 11th, and that Mike Pompeo met with them and signed an agreement that they would be the government, that they would be allowed to thrive and basically undercut.
Have a seat at the table, and
because they promised Trump that they were going to give up violence. I don't know what anybody else was supposed to do, because the project we had there, we didn't invest in for 20 years. Like, when you hear people talk about our level of investment, they'll talk about the number of soldiers that went, of course, the people who lost their lives, which is so tragic on the United States, from the United States and from Afghanistan and from Pakistan and from the region. So many people died. So they'll talk about that. They'll talk about how much military spending we put, how much military training we gave, as if the way you run a country is to have a strong military.
Yeah.
Like, when you've gotten to the point where the way you internally run your country is that your military is really strong, you're not running anything that looks like a society that we're all talking about in so many parts of the world. You're running a military state.
Well, that's what I've heard from so many experts. Is we went into this not having a clear goal. Were we nation building? Were we trying to replicate U.S. democracy in this country? What were we doing? There was never a clear goal other than get the bad guys. And then we built up this pseudo military in Afghanistan. This is according to experts I've listened to. And it was all based on the infrastructure and support of the U.S. military. And so when we pulled out, the Afghan army had no way to support itself. Logistics were a mess. They didn't have air support. And so they just said, hey, we're going to get slaughtered if we try to go against the Taliban. So Afghan soldiers were just taking off their uniforms and running for the hills because we did not put them in a position to succeed even militarily, let alone as a society, as a democracy.
And you think about how information moves in our world, right? We're in the most available information society in the history of humankind in the United States. People can listen to this right now. And we all know that it's hard sometimes to figure out what the truth is, what's going on, who's telling you the right things, who's manipulating. Like, it's hard. That's the same thing in Afghanistan, and they don't have the most sophisticated system of communication available. So you come into these and what are they hearing? They're not watching CNN. They're not reading some report on, does the U.S. support the government or support the Taliban? No, this is generations long of structures and power and relationships, and we think that the Taliban doesn't carry more cultural sway than the newly minted government that sort of has a 20-year track record and multiple leaders of it. It was just a mess. And this other idea that really gets at me, that I hear these commentators saying all the time, like everybody in the administration knew that the Taliban was ultimately going to, move across the country and take over.
Yeah.
But boy, it's the speed of it that they're surprised
Didn't
with.
see that coming.
Well, like the speed is like you would have been okay if this took 18 months instead of, 1 week.
Yeah.
Why would that be any, like, you just thought, oh, we have time to get our translators and get these people out. Ultimately, this is where it was going. They always assumed that. We just thought it was going to take a while to get here. Boy, that happened quick. That's the thing that we're now arguing about in this society, is you should have known it would happen quicker.
Right.
I think our military effort there failed, and we need to really do an action report to figure out why it failed. There just seems to be none of it. And it's,
well, and you wonder, like Biden just a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I think, said the likelihood of the Taliban sweeping over the country is very unlikely. And so what sort of information did the president of the United States have? Is he just gaslighting us, or did he have bad information? What, like, where is the failure in this system?
Like what? Yeah, that's right. Would the same decisions have been made by the Biden administration if they said, "Hey, the Taliban's going to take over within 14 days"? Would they have done the same thing? I think they would have. So I don't think this argument of like, well, we thought it was going to take a lot longer. It's the speed. They're just really struck by the speed. They were going to do this anyway.
Yeah.
Should they have? What would they, if they thought it was going to take 14 days or less? Would they have treated the evacuation of support of U.S. Forces out sooner? I don't know. They didn't. Yeah. So, hey, can you put Jake's comment up there? Jake Blues.
Yeah.
Jake said, I served in Afghanistan in 06 and 07. The average Afghani was indifferent to U.S. intervention. We knew back then that any exit from the country was going to be messy and that the Taliban would be back in force as soon as we were gone. So this is Jake saying, look, people like him that were paying attention to this for reasons of being there. He was saying, yeah, we all saw this. So again, that everyone saw it. And this is, I think, what Biden looked at. And I agree with Biden on this one. I don't agree with him on that they didn't be more prepared to get these support families out of Afghanistan. But the idea that the government collapsed within a week shows the fact that the United States shouldn't stay there anymore. I think what he was saying was, this is a lost cause.
Yeah.
And we're not going to stay there any longer because there's no indication that.
Right. 20 more years isn't going to fix this. Yeah. For a country that doesn't want us there. Yeah.
Just going to let that breathe for a second.
Yeah. It reminds me too a little bit that I've seen a lot of like, hey, we don't need armchair experts second guessing these decisions. And to some extent, I get that, like with COVID, like I'm frustrated with a lot of people second guessing like the doctors, like pretending they know more than the epidemiologists and the people that created the vaccine. So I get frustrated when they think they know better than the doctors. But in this case, we all can see that this turned out very poorly.
That's right.
And we might not know how it should have gone down, but we can point at it and say, no, this didn't work, and we need to figure out why it didn't work so that we can never repeat this.
Right. This is closer. This is maybe less like doctors now trying to figure out how to advocate for COVID relief, and more like doctors in the 50s and 60s telling us that smoking was actually good for you. Yeah, I think we can second guess those doctors. Right. That what was going on there, that was not, no, that's, the doctors were just wrong about this. And there's a thing in the military world, the military think, that becomes very insular and very targeted toward just the things that the military knows is important for their role, and that ends at some point, and other implications need to be picked up by others. And because we put so much weight on the military, these other pieces don't end up being fully developed.
Yeah.
And I sure hope Biden comes out and talks about this, that we need a different approach to how we're engaged in the places where we're militarily engaged, and to
Mm-hmm.
go into it. I mean, there was so much skepticism back before 2001 about if the U.S. should be intervening militarily in the world, even in the even in the military circles, in the military academies, and the thinkers. They were all very, very weary of and leery of getting involved in militarily anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that all had to be set aside because of the terrorist attacks and the way the United States chose to freak out for 20 years over the attacks of September 11th. And the implications of that 20 years on, and this anniversary is coming up in a few weeks. It has just been devastating to parts of our world and our society.
Mm-hmm.
The ripple effects of this just continue on and on and on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we go from that very difficult thing, and look, here's the other thing. It's easy for groups like us and people like us sit here and say, what we need the common good when it comes to these kinds of issues. We need some common good foreign policy approaches and some common good military engagement. But that's really hard to get to. It's difficult to do, and it takes some level of leadership, some level of expertise, and some level of creative thinking to get there. And frankly, that's been lacking in this situation. And it's not just Afghanistan. It's Afghanistan. It's Iraq. It's Syria. It's
Mm-hmm.
Iran. Our engagement in that entire region. The Bush administration was famous for saying, and I went along with this back in 2003 and 4, was, hey, this is an opportunity for the United States to extend its influence into the Middle East and to start to become more of a player there, and see if we can use the United States and Western Europe's influence to change the structures of what's become a habitual problem in the Middle East. I thought that was possible. That was not possible. It was
Mm-hmm.
wrong, and it didn't work. And we've seen it over and over and over. And to have to recognize that what we're all talking about is not what everybody in the world wants, and that we have not done the work necessary to make it a more attractive option. It has been a 20-year failure across the system. Funny enough, that's not what's happened in Vietnam or even in South Korea, right? Like Vietnam, we're trading partners with. People go there on vacation. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have thought in 1972 that 40 years later, people would be vacationing in Vietnam. So something worked there. What worked there is probably not going to work in Afghanistan. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think people are going to end up being like, hey, maybe, we haven't been to Kabul in a while. Why don't we schedule a trip there? That's likely not going to happen. So and it didn't happen in Vietnam because of the military. It happened because of other kinds of civil engagement. And
Yeah.
we should really get a military expert on here to talk about this. It's just so hard to do.
Yeah.
All right, lots of great comments in here. Thanks, everybody, for all of those comments. We're going to talk a little bit about Haiti as well. Another perpetually difficult place, this time one in the Northern Hemisphere. Haiti, the most, the poorest country in the world, oftentimes,
yeah.
and then in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, did I say Northern Hemisphere? In the Northern Hemisphere. In the Western Hemisphere. And, it's closer to us than a lot of us recognize, and they were struck by an earthquake in a less populated place than the earthquake that struck in Port-au-Prince in 2010, which is good news. I went to Haiti in 2010 and drove through the rubble and did some support people in orphanages. It's still burned into my mind and spirit how difficult it was. But 1,300 people dying in a less populated place, and that number will likely rise as they continue to move through, pulling the bodies out of the buildings and churches and homes that people find themselves in. And the idea that there's instability in the ground there, and that the construction requirements and processes in Haiti make housing very difficult to live in. It's one of those continuously difficult circumstances and situations.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who know, they know that there's an island, and on one half of the island is Haiti, and one half of that island is the Dominican Republic. And there's sort of two tales of two stories going on
Mm-hmm.
there. And it's there are systemic issues inside the Haitian um, government and inside the country that are not just because of location. There's other things that have gone on, and the United States has been deeply connected there, and it continues to be a humanitarian struggle for Haitians. And
Yeah.
I just know so many fantastic Haitians, and I know they want a country that's has the ability to thrive differently. It's just extremely difficult.
Yeah. It's so sad to see. I was talking to a pastor friend, um, born in Haiti, pastors several churches in Haiti, has planted churches, and he's far enough away that he wasn't affected, or his community, but he knows of many people who lost homes. And
Mm.
the struggle right now is it's a less populated area, and so the roads to get aid to those areas are just in shambles. And so you're dealing with logistics problems, just getting
Yeah.
water and food and medical supplies and rescue teams to these areas. And meanwhile, there's a tropical storm heading
Yeah.
their way, hitting like later today, which is going to make rescue efforts and
Oh, I didn't
relief
know that.
efforts
Unbelievable.
even more difficult. And this is, of course, just weeks after their president was assassinated, leaving the government in more turmoil.
Oh,
You've got
it is.
Yeah, you've got gangs creating blockades along streets that are actually intercepting aid trucks and just stealing the food and water meant for helping others. And so it's just like layers of difficulty, and it's hard to see. I was there after the 2010 earthquake. I led 3 trips down there helping with relief and stuff. And so beautiful, caring people that just can't catch a break, it seems like.
Yeah. Well, that's well said. Yeah. You know, there's some religious traditions where after a litany like that, they say, Lord, for these we pray. And there's just days where you think, is that all a lot of us can do?
Yeah.
And it's, some people don't even get comfortable with like saying, well, could I send money to help somewhere? Because I don't know if it's going to help.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult. I would say, yeah, if you have money to send to Haiti, send it to Haiti and detach from that money once you send it, because hopefully you'll choose wisely where it goes, but it might be used in ways that are not as efficient as you wanted, and you can't control that. So much of the world promised to help Haiti after 2010. This happens a lot. The
Billions of
huge
dollars were
billions
promised. Yeah.
promised, and then small amounts of it come, and then what comes, some of it is siphoned off for other purposes, and it's stolen and other things. And it would still be better to have billions of dollars go in than not. I think
Yeah.
we sometimes get a little too precious about what becomes of the dollars.
Mm-hmm.
It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Yeah, people in the chat talking about how some people, the only category they can find for all this is, as some people around Haitians have said, that the country is cursed. I'm not sure. Depends on what cursed means, but I don't think the problems are outside of human control. I think I think there's things human beings can do to make this to make this better. And then you wonder, because now we'll talk just for a brief minute here about our COVID update. I drove by a COVID don't try to mask us, don't try to vaccine us protest yesterday, right up the street from my house outside of a
Really?
hospital. Yeah, Dan, I mean, the last time I saw a lineup of people with a bunch of signs in their hands and yelling and wanting people to honk their horns, it was, people like me and you standing out on a street corner trying to stop the re-election of Donald Trump. So I had a lot of empathy for the people standing out there and couldn't have disagreed more with what they were saying and what they were doing. But it was a huge group. I mean, for a beautiful Sunday afternoon, it was hundreds of people. I wasn't totally clear on what all their arguments were. I think they were arguing about some kind of data information before vaccines are mandated, but there is no vaccine mandate coming. But then it was all range of like my body, my choice, which was an interesting series of
Yeah.
arguments. And then, people saying don't mask, and it was young, and it was predominantly female. And that was a thing that I noticed, because there's days where I tell myself that future generations and having, more women in charge is better. And I believe that so very deeply, but it's not just that simple, right? There's other issues at hand as well. And so, and we're talking about like where I live in Minneapolis area, right? Like this is not, heavily into that. So the good side was there were not very many cars honking their horns. Somebody who was along with us pointed this out, that, well, it's kind of quiet. There was one guy with his arm out his window doing a thumbs down sign. And I did it as long as I could until my arm got tired as I drove by. And so I didn't make any sounds. I just couldn't help myself but to say, oh my gosh. But here's the thing. And I mentioned this a couple of other times. I'm not sure it's people would agree with it or not. I think this is as good as we're going to get on the vaccine, and as good as we're going to get on COVID. I've so many people in my life who are not getting the vaccine, and what it basically comes down to is they don't think COVID's that big of a deal. That's basically the calculation. How dangerous do they feel it is? What do they think the impact of it's going to be? The risk of a mask. I mean, one woman at this rally had a sign that said, vaccines come and go, losing your freedom is forever. Not entirely sure that's accurate. I don't know. I think it could be wrong on every end. I don't know that they come and go. I think they come and stay around. And the way they go is with vaccines. So they don't just go on their own. Like, pick your virus that you've been afraid of, and what caused it to not be around. If it's not around, not people just doing nothing. And I don't know that loss of freedoms are forever. I don't know how she would have felt about the big seatbelt debate of the 1970s. Yeah, maybe similarly. I remember my grandmother being totally against seatbelts. My dad being sort of indifferent about it. Did you ever have anybody in your life that was against seatbelts back in
yeah. I have a staunch anti-seatbelt friend.
To this day.
I mean, they wear a seatbelt, but mostly because the alarms in the cars.
That's right. That's right. He just strict. Yeah, but that's I don't think our freedoms are gone forever. I think our freedoms are well in hand.
And like, I don't see a ton of protests about having to wear shirts in restaurants.
Totally.
Like what freedoms are we talking about?
I wanted to do some little video skit where he'd come into a restaurant with no shirt, no shoes, but a mask. And be like, I'm willing to do the mask, but I'm not wearing a shirt anymore. There's no reason I should have. This is
America.
I can't have bare feet. Shoes are dirtier than feet. Yeah. I mean, just basic health codes are a thing.
Yeah. I guess what I don't get is the anger around masks. And we talked last week about like these school board meetings or town hall meetings where they'll bring in doctors and nurses, experts in why masks should be required in a school, for example. And people show up in the hundreds with signs and angry speeches. And then just last week, a doctor was leaving one of these, and he was like accosted basically by this angry mob. And wouldn't you know it, one of the angry mob, the guy that says you can leave freely, but we will find you, was identified as Dwayne Laring, a former member of Christian rock band Audio Adrenaline. So what?
So okay, that story I think it was out of Johnson City, Tennessee. I remember watching the video. Maybe other people did too. It's a bald-headed man who's standing at a car window with a crowd, including police officers, screaming at the doctor through the window. We know who you are. We will find you. The man tries to take a in the car tries to take a picture of him. He covers it up. It's a whole to do before the doctor pulls out, and you're like, this is just the worst. And I thought at the time, it's not going to take long for our social media to identify who these people are that are on this screen, and the tables are going to turn on these people, right? They're going to be outed. They're going to be made to account for what they did in public spaces. I had no idea the guy was going to be somebody that was a founding member of rock bands from the Christian
Sonic
community.
Flood.
I mean, really something, right? Like, well, okay, there we have it. So that subculture, and I don't want to blame, I don't want to suggest that, someone like Dwayne Laring, who's, into non-masking, represents all evangelicals or all people that liked, audio adrenaline music. But maybe, I don't know. I also don't want to let them off the hook for that. I'm so glad that people are identifying these folks, though. Like, look, every one of us is welcome to our opinion. We should share it. I actually feel when I drove by that crowd of people outside my house, I thought, if I were against vaccines, which I'm not, I hope everyone will get this COVID-19 vaccine. If I were against masking, which I'm not, I hope people wear masks whenever they're required and necessary. I would have felt like, however, if I was against vaccines and masking, that the whole culture seems to be against me. It's hard to find anywhere on the news that you could watch anything that would verify your position. It's hard to find friends who would do. Like, you would really feel like you were under the gun. And then the government, now the federal government, and often state governments and city school boards, and all of this are all sort of saying another thing, that there's something in our society where those folks want to rally up. We should recognize how important it is to have counter messaging and protest messaging against anything that our society is calling normative. That's just an important part of a healthy society. Absolutely. But there are some things that when that protest attitude, protest mechanism is kicked in, we should be like, I don't think we should honor that topic of the protest in the same way. So if someone said, I don't think that that people who are not from the same race should marry each other or go to school dances together, I think we should be around like, no, we don't think that that's something that the protest should receive cultural support. You're welcome to hold that view. We don't think it should be supported, though. That doesn't mean that other protests aren't important. And this masking and vaxing is interesting place. Is it in the space that we're like, hey, this is legitimate protest, legitimate disagreement that's come about in the last 18 months, and we're working through this as a society? Or is this totally out of bounds and so obscure it shouldn't be close? And I think it's hard to make the argument that it's totally obscure. Now, again, I am not saying that my own opinion is that the science is clear enough on vaccines and masking. But how we're going to navigate that should be held under the deep scrutiny of public resistance and protest while we do it. So I think we have to find a space between sort of like, I don't get the anti-vaxxers, I don't get the non-mask wearers, which a lot of us just have a hard time wrapping our heads around, but there's a lot of this. Now it's 20% of the population, maybe 30% of the population. I don't know, but that's a lot. Like that.
Not insignificant.
Not insignificant. It's a great way to say it. So I don't know. I think we have to be, we have to say, this is where we are. And this sits in a space of people feeling like they have to put up a resistance to it. So what do we do about that? Other issues that now we would say are out of bounds, and what I would say do not deserve the support of cultural protest. When they were first raised, people were supporting them. So the civil rights movement and the ability for people to marry outside of their racial boundaries. That was something that a lot of people supported. That seemed legitimate back then, and now it's not. I'm guessing this one's going to also move that direction. I mean, if there was a bunch of people out there to our conversation earlier about seatbelts, or about, I don't have to buy a car with tempered glass, I should be able to have shards of glass in my windshield. No, I should be able to have leaded gas in my car. No, I shouldn't have to make sure that my kids are, not working under the age of 14. No. Like, these are all things that people used to argue about. Now we don't anymore. And to argue about them would seem totally culturally unnecessary of the level of support. Where are we on masking and where are we on vaccines? I don't know. I don't think we're to the point where it's just clear enough that it doesn't warrant some level of social pushback. Now, I know for some people, are going to be like, oh my gosh, yes, it does. 100% it does. There's no question on this. The science is clear, da, 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 da. And to those folks, I say, look, I get you. I'm close to that position as well. But last April, 1st April of this, masks were not did not seem reasonable. So some of us have moved on from where we were last April, 2 Aprils ago, and some people haven't yet. I think ultimately people are going to get there and look back on this period and say, well, when I was saying kids shouldn't have to wear masks when they go to school, it was on principle. It wasn't on the, that's where this stuff will go when the science plays out. But the role of cultural protest in significant issues like this is it's its own thing. Now, men standing around screaming at people in a car, we're going to basically hunt you down. We know who you are. We know where you live. Never appropriate, not part of any kind of protest culture. That's just out of bounds over and over. The smiling people standing on the side of the road with signs up and down, trying to get people to honk on their behalf and receiving a thumbs down from a
good for you. Yeah.
Angry guy. That feels like, no, that, we can't support protest and the right to protest our government, First Amendment right of freedom of speech and freedom of protest, and then basically say, well, not on this topic, if it's a topic that we think is still inside the cultural norm. And I think that's where we find ourselves. And it's not a comfortable place to be.
Yeah.
Because we feel like this is not just an issue of principle, it's an issue of life and death. And that feels like it changes it. That's what Valerie writes in the chat. That's what makes it different for a lot of people, is that it's about the public health. And that's a good argument. That's an important argument to include as we say what deserves our support of public protest or not.
Yeah, and the tone of these types of engagements, these types of protests, just seems fundamentally different. Whether it's the physical threats of stopping someone's car and saying, we know where you live, we're going to find you, or some of the other veiled threats. I watched a couple of videos from the meeting where a woman is saying basically like, wait till we rise up and we're not going to take this anymore. Sort of, there's this underlying, like, we're approaching more violence if you don't listen to us. And it's always, veiled in such a way as it can be written off as, rhetorical. But there seems to be this just underlying anger that I don't quite understand.
Yeah, and it's I'm with you. It's that anger, and it's this like, it's our freedoms thing, which is kind of the point that I made earlier on. If people have been listening for the whole time, when I said I get nervous about, even when I do this or anyone else, where you take a particular crisis moment and try to use that to make your larger point that's not specifically about that crisis moment of suffering. So I was doing it about Afghanistan and how I think the military is overvalued in our society. This often happens around guns, that when there's a murder, a mass shooting, there's a period of time where you need to talk about the tragedy and not the situation yet, that thing.
Don't politicize the tragedy. Yeah.
This is also one of those points that for people to be like, hey, I really want to make sure the government doesn't have enough, doesn't overstep its power. Like maybe vaccines help, maybe masks help, but let's worry about being careful of our freedoms. Like when you're in a moment of crisis here, let's err on the side of let's do the safe best thing we can for the next period of time. Look, what every state and the federal government has shown is that as soon as the threat of the COVID virus is diminished, the masking requirements are lifted. The reason they've come back in is because the numbers of infections and the numbers of deaths and the number of people impacted is going up. So can we just trust each that when that goes back down, then the public health requirements will be lessened? So it's not forever. And this idea that somehow this binary foreverism is the thing that's driving people, and that, the next thing we know, people are going to come knocking on our door. And when they do, you should shoot them dead with a gun, the way that Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from outside of Atlanta, puts it. Like, that's just not, you're not Paul Revere here. Like somehow this is general public health issues about kids wearing a mask at school to not spread a disease that we know impacts people. And we're trying to keep from collapsing our health system, which is starting to do again in places all around the country. Mm-hmm. So just even kind of tempering this thing back to the non-permanent state feels to me like that could be something quite helpful and important for us to get after. Well, so many good comments in here in the chat as well. Dan, if there's some, do you think there's a way? We'll just do a little business in front of all of you. So we use the system called Ecamm to present this, and we use a system called Restream to put this out into the world. And in Restream, we can put it onto multiple channels. So it's on Periscope, it's on Facebook, it's on YouTube, it's on multiple Facebook pages. It's around and about. The only place it isn't, because it's not integrated in this, is Instagram, which we love for them to
don't
fix
play nice.
Somewhat. If what would be great is if there was a way where all the chat that we see that comes from all those channels could all be gathered up and put into one stream somewhere. Wouldn't that be a nice thing? Because I see some of these people, Margie and Peggy and Kevin and Jimmy and Mike and Valerie and Sarah and Denise and Jan and Michelle and Nikki, Cheryl, Peggy, Jim, all these people are writing these, and they only sometimes see the people in their own channel. So if they're on Periscope, they're seeing other Periscope, or Twitter on Twitter, or on YouTube on YouTube. Or it'd be great if everybody could see all of them. It's just, I don't know.
I wonder if we can get a little live feed of all those. I'll look into it.
Yeah, see if there's a way that we could do that, because we so appreciate all of you chatting it up, and we'd love for you all to see what the other people are saying that we're able to see.
While also being able to curate and leave out some comments. Because any internet comment section, sometimes it gets unsavory.
Yeah. Because, Dan, you can just grab one and show people if they're not paying attention. We can grab particular ones and pop them up on the screen. Then anyone looking at the screen sees that comment, but they don't see any of the other comments that people make to that person inside the chat in the more ongoing conversation. So I don't know how we would get to all of that, but maybe there's a way. And those of you that listen only on the audio version, you wouldn't get any of that sort of anyway, unless we did like a right channel, left channel, and someone was just reading all of the comments. See, wouldn't that be kind of fun? Someone was like, from Dodie Levinson, because Trump, their leader, touts anger and the definition of masculine men. It's coming out of your right ear pod, and then you and I and other guests are talking out of their left, and it becomes just crazy, just crazy business. What would be kind of fun is maybe we keep all these comments, and then we just read them in order at the end of the podcast, at the end of our time, with no commentary or relationship to whatever we've currently been talking about over the last hour. I don't know, there's 100 comments or something here. You get all these comments just read like Reader's Theater. In fact, the first one today was from 6ZSXF75. Want to become famous? ? Buy followers, primes, and views on cutt.ly. So the first comment, a piece of spam.
Yep.
And then after that, Mike, says,
Yeah,
good morning.
love
And
it.
so many people left behind from Jim. So sad. Uh, and then Sean says, we trained their defense forces for 20 years. The fall of Kabul is on them, not on us. And So we just become, this sort of readout that would take a while if we were to do
Yeah.
something like that. So all that to say, we appreciate all of your listener support, your listenership, all that you're doing. Be sure you're on our Vote Common Good email list. And if you're interested in supporting what we're going to do this fall, in just a couple of weeks now, where we turn our attention toward life on the borderlands, we're going to be doing that. It's going to include a Tuesday night regular live update from the ride that we'll be doing. So we come with you from that, and we're going to ask you to make some financial contributions to sponsor us. In the next day or so, we're going to be launching a per mile sponsorship. So you could say, hey, I want to help fund you guys for 10 miles of your ride, or for 50 miles of your ride, or for the all 3,600 miles of your ride. Some cryptocurrency, fraction of a penny amount for 3,600 miles, something like that. Or $1 per mile. That would even be better. Or, look, if you want to do $10 a mile for all the miles, we'll take it. So just round it up to $3,500 and we'd feel great about it.
Yeah.
I'm only partially kidding on that one. We'd love to have a contribution of that size. But we're going to be telling the stories of the people that we meet along the border as we travel on bicycles along this way, being close to the ground, close to the people. And sometimes when we go on our tours around this shop, we're trying to give people a window into a new way to think about things. This tour is about asking the people closest to the border situation, how should we be thinking about these things from your perspective? So it's a unique way for us to move, and we would love your support, love your help. We're going to be hosting rides, collective rides, on the weekend of the 17th and 18th of October 17th and 18th, all around the country. And if you want to ride with us virtually, maybe you ride a bike, maybe you ride a stationary bike, I don't know, maybe you just go on a walk and you want to sort of keep up with us, we have ways for you to follow and track with us virtually. And some of that's going to be coming out here in the next couple of days as well.
Well, one
all
last
right,
last great comment. Shondell says, I'm so thankful for you all and your comments. You give me hope as a Christian. So often the religious right defines Christianity, and it's so good to see that the Christian left actually exists. Love and God's blessings to you all.
That's Shondell, that's very nice. Was that on the Christian Left Facebook page?
I am not sure. Even in this feed, I can't tell what Facebook page they're coming from.
Oh, it just says Facebook. Yeah. It just says it's on Facebook. I can see your little logo on there. Well, thank you, Shondell. And we appreciate all of you too. So we'll be back with politics and the common good tomorrow on Tuesday. See ya.